This presentation is brought to you by Alpha Echo, specializing in security advice and enterprise-wide cyberworthiness. Telstra, we're always better together. Nui Tech People, created to build strong tech communities.
My name's Sam. I like to test mobile apps. These are some of the apps I've worked on. Oh, there we go. We've also got some rendering issues. My app testing journey started with Tyro Payments back with Objective-C on iOS nearly 10 years ago now. And since then, I've worked on a mapping application. I can't say who the client was because I was a contractor, and this talk is recorded. So I can't officially say who that client was. So I've removed all references to that potential client, but mapping and navigation application, that was more on the Android side. After that, a bit of work at Insight Timer. I wouldn't believe, as a tester, I never thought I would work for a meditation app. Would you believe, as a software tester, I was quite expensive, and I was one of the first redundancies to go when budgets became tight. Colonial First State, their superannuation and investment mobile app, got to see that go through internal beta release to launch to market, and I just finished a contract at Everyday Rewards working on that app for about a year and a half. So anyway, the rough structure of what we're going to go through today, we're going to go through how to build in elements of quality from design to automation with a hypothetical app, and some other elements of quality that I've seen often missing in all of these apps that I've worked on as well. There'll also be some stories from the trenches as well. Hypothetical app to log your poo. I want to call it bog logger. Introducing the Bristol stool chart. What's up with my... I'm still getting syncing issues. So I think I might go back here, but introducing the Bristol stool chart, a 1 to 7 rating system for rating your poo. I hope most people have had a 3 to 4 today, or I hope you have one in your future later on today. Whereas if you're a number 1, you might have been in a bit of discomfort, a bit constipated. Number 7, a little bit watery, or you probably would not be able to sit here in comfort if you were on that end of the scale. So I hope everyone's got some nice 3 or 4s in their backlog today. Why is gut health important? It's a good metric for monitoring your overall health. I've had some surgeries that have involved my bowel system, so monitoring the quality of my output was kind of important as part of the whole process of recovery. There can be some other health indicators as well. If you've got some odd colours coming up, that's usually a very good indicator to go to your GP. This is not health advice, but if you are noticing some oddities, talk to your GP straight away. It can also indicate reactions to medication. If you've been taking painkillers, it has a chance to make you feel a bit constipated. And also IBS tends to impact up to 15% of our population, and it's kind of an underdiagnosed condition. And I feel like there's a huge amount of connections with our gut health, our mental health, history of obesity, and a whole bunch of other co-related morbidities. And it's really interesting that there's a huge amount of research still going on, but there is still so much that we would like to learn. If you would like to learn more about microbiome and gut health, Gut by Gulia Enders is also a good read. I listen to that on Audible because I don't have brain space to sit down and read these days. But, you know, listening to books at double speed on Audible is more my jam. That's a good book. So if you're going through the process of designing a new app, first of all, you should do some market research. Have a look around, see what other apps already exist. One heuristic for what new features that you want to build is to look at the 2 to 3 star reviews of all of these apps out there and see what people are complaining about. So when I first had this idea and I was starting prototyping, one of the issues that came up is like there are lots of poop emojis with a whole bunch of these apps. which is fine. Poop can be funny, but poop can also be a taboo subject for a lot of people who might be using your app, particularly if they're using these for medical reasons. You wouldn't really want to have a poop emoji on your mobile device and being able to have someone look over your shoulder and see exactly what you're logging. So that was often a common remark for a lot of these apps that already exist on the market, is they're not very professional looking, and I don't want to have this type of app seeable over my shoulder. And another, so just looking at the general feedback for existing apps, kind of like the AI talk this morning, that if you want to explore AI, there's probably an AI for that. There is guaranteed an app for that as well. And so if you're trying to build a new app, it's almost guaranteed to not be a new idea these days, but there's nothing wrong with building a better version of a pre-existing app out there. With different elements of quality that you care about, or just for your own personal uses as well. You don't need to publish apps on the App Store if you just want to play around with the technology as well. But starting doing with a bit of market research is usually a good point. And then one element of quality is privacy by design. A few years ago, there was the GDPR Act in Europe. We've got something similar in the works here in Australia, but if you just think about privacy by design, you want to have a simplified terms and conditions, something that people can read quite easily. You want to be transparent with all the data you're being collected. You want to give people an opt-in. So, for example, I'm imagining when I build out the minimum viable product, or just the very first version, just to test out this application, I can just store everything on device. I don't need to log your poo in my backlog. I don't need to have that information stored, and then if I do start storing it in a backend, I don't need to log that information for more than 30 days. If you automatically delete data after 30 days, you are GDPR compliant by default, because anyone needs to be GDPR compliant. One of the things that needs to happen is when people raise a request for you to delete their data, you've got 30 days to action that request. You can build your systems in such a way that you are GDPR compliant by default, or if you anonymize data that you are collecting like downloads and screen views, if all of that data is anonymized, then you are also GDPR compliant as well. So just a consideration of privacy, particularly with all of these breaches and concerns that people have with, what are you doing with all of my data? And if you're just be transparent with what you're using it for. But there is a strong emphasis on not collecting more data than what you need, but all of the tools and technology make it really easy to collect way more data than we need. And if you're just prototyping apps, really question all the data. Consideration for quality for localization. When I was at Insight Timer, we were trying to localize that meditation app, and because this app had existed for 8 years at the time, it was actually a significant amount of work to translate into other languages. If you are launching a new app, consider launching in languages like Spanish, Hindi, and Arabic, because that gets you a pretty large portion of the world out there. So if you are thinking of launching globally, there are more people who speak Spanish than English out there. But you also have to consider things like localization. We went through the Bristol stool chart. Does that idea translate to other cultures? And turns out there is a paper where that has been translated into Spanish. So, and it works well for people in medical situations in Spain. So just translating the Bristol stool chart would work in a Spanish context as well. One consideration for Arabic, even if we are having issues. Anyway, thank you. One of the considerations for Arabic, and this is a really cool feature that you can do on Android if you want to test Android devices, if you enable dev mode in Android, you can force right to left rendering without even selecting an Arabic language. You can cause so many quirky bugs. Even with big global apps out there, there were still issues with forced right to left rendering. And I feel like a lot of people who are designing user interfaces don't consider that things are mirrored in different parts of the world. And it's fun to find some bugs. They're a lot easier to find on Android. iOS doesn't have the same test functionalities to force right to left. I have some internet cookies out there that think I speak Hebrew, simply because I've been doing mobile testing and some language setting synced up to some cloud, and now half the internet for me is in Hebrew, which is fine, but it can cause some quirky behavior as well. Designing apps for the Chinese market is a little bit challenging, but particularly with translated strings, strings can be either a lot shorter or phrases can be a lot longer as well. But because of releasing apps into China usually requires working behind the Great Firewall of China and exploring Alibaba Cloud. If you're just putting out a prototype out there just to talk about some stuff, doing it English first and then exploring, even though that could give you a really big section audience, first of all, I don't know how well Boglogger translates into Chinese or how I would go about releasing apps to that market. So that's why it's not potentially a priority for localization, at least right off the bat. It's something that's worth putting in the back burner and going, I want to learn more about that, how to do that market, and investigate a better way of doing that. Also, like if you're going through the process of designing apps, coming up with different personas can help you concentrate on different elements of quality. So I can use myself as a persona for Boglogger because I've had surgery. Maybe having a persona for an older user who might have slight mobility issues. There's an increase in disability with older people. They might struggle to interact with user interfaces. Having different demographics of personas can help you focus on different elements of quality. So I wanted to make this app accessible by default, but imagine a vision impaired user is coming along and they don't want to be in a public toilet and be going like, hey Siri, log a number 2 for me. And Siri's like, is that smooth like a sausage? So you just want to be aware of the context of where people could use this app, and if they're using voice prompts to help navigate this, particularly in a public situation. You don't want to be leaking information that is kind of private and sensitive. But it's also useful to think about like how someone with low vision would interact with this app. There is an added benefit of if you focus on accessibility first, a lot of your automation can come for free, because if your screen, the tools that are used for UI automation, if they can't distinguish all of your elements on the screen, if all your buttons are labeled button, it can make it really hard to build out UI automation. So by having buttons with appropriate names, you make it easier for vision impaired users, but also easier for test automation later on as well. So I'm going to go through some stories from the trenches there to give you an idea of how a test strategy can evolve over time. So in context, I'm talking about when I was working on this app in particular. At the time, this was Colonial First State was owned by Combank, and they were going through a demerger process. And this was the elements of the test strategy that we wanted to build and enhance going further. With a test strategy, you kind of want to assess like where we are now, what we're doing, what we're working well, but you also want to have a future goal. It's no point coming up with a strategy today if you don't revisit it in the future, or if it doesn't help you move towards a particular goal in mind. Otherwise, they're just fluffy good ideas. So When it comes to test strategy, I like to think of feedback loops. Instead of pass-fail conditions, we have elements of quality at all stages through the lifecycle process. I'd like to think of feedback loops help us answer the question, are we ready to ship this software to our customers right now? Are we concerned with any risks or issues getting this software in front of customers? And there is a bunch of testing that can feed into each different loop at different stages, and it's more of a cascading feedback loop rather than a test pyramid, inverted pyramid, other ideas as well. So at that build phase, working with the team, we had iOS dev, Android dev, backend dev, 2 test engineers, a designer. So it was a small cross-functional team, and working together in the context of big giant corporate. Dev would be responsible for building features and building out unit tests. We would pair then with doing code review, coming up with UI test coverage, and then brainstorming how to do more further down testing towards the ship. Cool. I am missing things. Anyway, this just happens with being a tester. Things just break around me. I mean, like, the thing is, when it comes to testing, testers don't break software. It was built broken. We just help you discover where it might be broken. Anyway, I do need to check that stuff is happening a bit more. But, deploying that continuous testing approach, raising a pull request, merging into dev, automatically releasing test builds is pretty standard practice for mobile teams these days. For iOS, we were using XeTest, and they would run on every PR and merge into dev. We also were experimenting with snapshot tests. These were pretty easy to implement for iOS, and they did make the code review process pretty easy. It's just when you had a screenshot of the app, and the next time it builds, it just checks that screen matches the previous screenshot that had been submitted into master. So you could decouple front-end and back-end testing. It was pretty cool. We were investigating how to implement that for Android as well. Android, we were using Gradle to run our tests, and they were pretty stable, using Espresso with robots patterns. I think there is a different preferred pattern these days with the new Android framework, but test frameworks come and go, and all of these words blend in together, and I can't remember what we were using more recently. However, on the Android UI test side, there we go, it was generally a lot more flakier. This was the issue with Android UI tests specifically. They still wouldn't take too long to run, so it wasn't too hard to run them locally. Having tests and getting that feedback in less than 5 minutes is great fun. It definitely long build times and UI tests. I remember when I first joined Tyro Payments, our iOS tests were taking 25 minutes, and that was a very long time. And so we were just working on trying to reduce that build time. But yeah, we would get more intermittent failures that were more related to Google SDKs on the Android side that weren't really related to our code per se. And I think flaky tests are the bane of nearly every developer out there. Any written test has to come with comes with a cost of maintenance, and the value that test provides has to exceed that cost of maintenance, because you have flaky UI tests, you have tests that change all the time, require updating, and it can be quite annoying. And so that was an issue with Android specifically. When doing mobile app testing, I found it really useful to have a whole bunch of Android emulators at different Android versions, because I would find that the developers on my team, they were always testing on the latest and greatest and the fastest, more likely to have a Google Pixel that had only been released in the last year or two. So they had fast devices, and they were using vanilla Android. And so you didn't really find a huge amount of issues. Whereas just spinning up, Android 6 and running the app and seeing how shitty it is a great way to find a whole bunch of bugs as well. Like testing apps on restricted hardware, old hardware. If you've got an old Samsung S5 floating around in your drawer somewhere, using that for a little bit of Android testing. I still have one of those Android devices, and it's great to spin up. And it's like it still runs apps. Oh my god, this is pretty cool. As opposed to on the iOS side, we've got things tend to rotate a little bit more quickly on the iOS side. But yes, if you want a heuristic for finding bugs, running on tiny screens as well is also another way. Increasing the font as well is another way to find some really quirky bugs. Building in a mocking framework inside your mobile app so you can completely decouple front-end and back-end testing is exceptional, and being able to have feature flags as well as part of that. So most of my code commits were actually maintaining our mocking framework. The way we would operate, we would be building back-end APIs, and they would generally be a sprint or two ahead of front-end development. So as a tester, I would go in, test some of the APIs, collect some of the sample payloads, and then actually add that to the mocking framework so that the UI developers next sprint could see what that data would look like on the screen without having to talk to a dedicated test environment. We were able to add different profiles for different personas, so that sales and marketing could have a look at what the app to look like, and support could actually had access to this test build where if you shook the app, it would get the profile selector up, and you can change what the app looks like for a retiree versus someone who's in accumulation phase for their superannuation as well. And that being able to test the UI almost independently of the front end was a real power move. If you've got the capability to build in a mocking framework into your front end, there are a lot of benefits. It also meant that as a tester, I had access to the build code. If I wanted to test an element that, for example, test an element that had a really long string with no spaces because I wanted to try and break the UI or see line wrapping or whatnot, I can just change the code locally, rebuild it, and then look at that screen with that profile, as opposed to if I wanted to do that with a dedicated test environment, set up the account, set up the data, log in, and do all of this process. It's just so much quicker to be able to have access to those tools to do that quick exploratory testing for your own benefit as well. It's like that code didn't need to be committed as part of that profile, but having access to those types of tools, it made testing so much easier in the moment as well. Feature flags as well were great, which were controlled by a backend service for production. But you had in the test and debug builds, you had ways to switch them on or off to test different things. I've seen feature flags on the Woolworths side used very extensively, and they do have a lot of benefit, but they can get to a certain point where they get kind of hard to manage. I know, for example, so for the Everyday Rewards app, I was working on everyday pay and gifting. So the feature that you've got this wallet and you can go into Woolworths and you can scan your QR code and that will sync to your wallet. And if you've got any gift cards in your wallet, it will automatically spend them at checkout. This was switched off recently for about 2 weeks. I was chatting to the old team asking why, and they're like, fraud, I think, was the main reason, but it's glad it switched back on. But that feature was actually built behind a feature flag so that if they had issues in production, they can just switch it off and say QR code payments aren't working right now, build out a fix or a solution, redeploy the app, and then switch it back on with new release version, it's switched on, but old release version, maybe it's switched off for whatever reason. So they can be really powerful for managing things in production as well. So going into more exploratory testing, if you want to assess for a framework for assessing UI automation, you build out a little graph XYZ plane, and you analyze all your flows, all your screens through your app or all your backend APIs or any way you want to segment your app. And then you can pop these on a risk-based heuristic. And things that are in the top quadrant that are really important, you might want to invest a huge amount of exploratory testing. You want to check that you have automation coverage for almost as many scenarios as you can brainstorm. But features down in the leftmost quadrant, you might not automate as much or at all. So as an example, say you've got login. Login's usually the most frequently used feature of an app. And that usually sits up in the top right corner, whereas maybe, I don't know, contact us or navigating to your beneficiaries in your superannuation account is more lower impact. But you may want to add other elements of risk. So this is just from a user point of view. Compliance and risk and privacy might say that beneficiaries is actually really important because there are legal ramifications. If that feature doesn't work in a particular way, we still want to verify that that feature works correctly. I do have more workshop material for going into this type of framework in a bit more detail as well, and there will be references to a QR code right at the end if you want references for this stuff a little bit later as well. Going through testing notes, I like to have, instead of exhaustive test strategy per feature, I like to have like a quick little Confluence page. So for if I was testing a new feature, I'd create this Confluence page for this feature. If it called one or two APIs, I would include sample payloads of all of those APIs and sample responses in this Confluence page as like a code snippet drop down as well. And then as I was going through different iOS and Android testing, noting down the account numbers that I used, if it's in a UAT or test environment, collecting the screenshots for iOS and Android. I found when testing new features in particular, having iOS and Android screenshots side by side is a great heuristic. It's also great for designers. You can go, hey, this is what they look like for both. Do you have any feedback? And the product owner can also raise feedback at that particular time. So this would become part of our sprint overview or feature overview when we were doing some of the shoulder checks as well. One of the benefits to this lightweight approach is like if a feature had been revisited, for example, insurance and superannuation, we were making some tweaks. Instead of going like, I can't remember how the hell I tested that feature, I go back to my testing notes. I'm like, I used account 1, 2, and 3. Number 3 fits this situation where we're just changing it for one particular situation, and just retest it quickly for there. So collecting these notes made it really useful for potential regression testing later on down the path. But these were just quick throwaway types of notes, and it was just a way to document what I had tested, why I had tested it, any weird observations, any bugs that went into the backlog related to the feature was also kind of documented here. Sometimes even the database query, that if we were testing completely down from front end to database, we would include the SQL commands for how to verify some of these. So just like collecting your notes on how you tested a feature does make it easier for coming back as well. If there were web changes as well, being able to have the screenshots of all mobile and web side by side as well was quite useful. So we would only do this when we have new designs going in or new API changes. If we were just doing business as usual stuff, we wouldn't necessarily use this all the time. We had minimum accessibility standards for new features as well. It was just every new feature must work with large font. If you ever want to see how an app breaks, just increase that font size. And you will find quite a few bugs. It shouldn't be a hard standard to meet, but if you want to show the designers you work with some of the weird ways their designs work, just increase that font size. Every new feature must work with a screen reader. Doesn't necessarily mean that it is perfect per se, but that feature works. When it comes to accessibility, there are so many extra tweaks that you can make around the edges, and the bar is so low, particularly for mobile. There is currently no standard that you can be assessed at for mobile. It is changing as opposed to web. There is the A2 standard, or there's version 2 and there's version 3. They are working on expanding that version 3 standard to incorporate mobile. But right now, there's nothing really other than companies should make a best effort to be accessible, and we could do so much more there. But I don't want to rant and rave on how to do accessibility testing. I can though. Also, just color contrast standards will be met as well. That was our commitment to accessibility. Doesn't have to be complicated. Can be pretty straightforward. For backend testing, I have experimented with using K6 for performance testing. I did really enjoy implementing K6. So I was an interim QA manager for Frankie One, which does identity and fraud detection via APIs for online banking applications and finance sectors. This is not going to be a K6 tutorial per se, but if you've got a Postman collection already for your backend APIs, it's really easy to import those scripts into a K6 script and then do your performance testing from there. So also K6 has a Chrome extension that you can install to monitor all of your API traffic, and it can export it out to a K6 script as well. When it comes to fleshing out performance testing, there are lots of tools these days that make it so much easier. If you're starting from a Postman script or Chrome extensions where you just record and playback, there can be some pretty powerful tools. We didn't do much pen testing, unfortunately, because there was another team in the bank structure that it was kind of every 3 to 6 months there'd be an occasional pen testing audit, or if there was a new authentication API being updated, we'd include that team. I think this is kind of a bad practice, but when you're dealing with big giant corporate structures, it can be really hard to encourage that security is a team responsibility, particularly when these companies have dedicated teams for a particular feature. And we didn't do a huge amount of performance testing in this context either, because again, there was potentially another team. And I don't like this approach, but it is an approach. When we were looking into end-to-end testing, one of the issues with mobile development is you have a whole bunch of supported apps out there. You've got from version 1 to version 2.5 today that actually exist in production and can be running concurrently as well. So this is an issue that impacts mobile, doesn't necessarily impact web that much, because your web front end is updated as soon as you release to production, and every time someone refreshes the browser, they're generally calling down your latest code. But when it comes with mobile teams, you basically have this question of, can every supported app version talk to every API? Contract testing through Pact can help you achieve this. There is version controls that can happen. I think as a minimum, when you're looking through frequent releases, at least using your minimum supported version, or at least your previous dev version as well, or current production version, and your dev version side by side. In practice, the teams that I've worked on, this hasn't been a huge issue. It has come up on occasion, but you can build your APIs in such a way that if you are adding new data structures to APIs, adding them in a particular way such that they don't break backwards compatibility for existing mobile apps is usually the recommended. But if you do have to deprecate an API payload because there's now a better way of doing things, that's usually when you might force an upgrade if you've got like a minimum supported version API and you're like everyone on version 1.5 now has to update to version 2. You also want a way to manage that as well. However, people are usually reluctant to deprecate particular features, even if it's just 2% of the market. At the time, these were built using Appium C#. I don't like Appium. I don't want to touch the temporal pole. I prefer to work on automation code where it's collaboration between testers and engineers. But Appium was used at the time. Having an automation framework written in C# and our developers are using Kotlin and Swift, means that developers don't want to touch that code with a 10-foot pole. I don't want to touch that code. I don't want to check out another IDE and run another test and go through all of that rigmarole. And if testers don't want to touch it, if developers don't want to touch it either, we decrease collaboration and we don't encourage quality as a team responsibility. You can run a bug bash in your team on a regular cadence to encourage everyone to find some bugs. You've got a couple of new features coming up. Come together for an afternoon, share some snacks, and give out prizes for your best bug hunters. Everyone can find bugs in software. I'm going to palm through a little bit, but just some breakdown of iOS devices. I found it really interesting that we had 2 iPod users when we were doing device testing. And just a summary of that overall strategy. We had an Android breakdown as well. Android is a little bit slower for uptake than iOS. Nearly all of our top 10 Android devices were a Samsung. Used to be back in the day when I was first starting my testing career and doing mobile testing, there was huge fragmentation between iOS and Android was such a big problem. These days, as long as you've got a Samsung device floating around, you kind of catch most of the Android-specific bugs. It's a lot more streamlined these days, and you don't have weird UI bugs anymore or different screen sizes, because different screen sizes impacts everyone. So you don't have to have that weird Asian-style model popular in China for all your testing. However, Android is not as robust as iOS. Monitoring for crashes on Android is a lot more important versus iOS. There's one crash. And we had a commitment to always monitor for crashes and try to investigate issues in a timely manner. This was when we were put forward the strategy. These were the milestones that we wanted to work towards. There was a couple of things we wanted to work on in the short term, and then potentially, add screenshot tests for Android or have some sort of automated accessibility testing as well. Would this strategy apply to bug logger? No, this is way over engineered. And if I wanted to build a prototype app and release it over the next little bit, I'm not going to use this strategy for bug logger. But it was a strategy we use in banking with finance and regulation and all of that jazz. So you can use a strategy that's kind of in between the two, and hopefully learn a thing about testing. I just wanted to encourage that quality is a team responsibility. It's not just palmed over the fence, but this is a way to talk about it. Just a shout out for a couple of events. If you are in Sydney on the 2nd of July, Beer Ops is a great networking event. Testing Talks is a conference I'm helping spiel, and Yale Conference in December as per keynote this morning. I will be at the Equal Experts booth if you want to chat further. Also, I'm in between contracts at the moment. So if you want someone to do a lunchtime learning session, walk through some of this stuff with some of your teams. I enjoy coaching and mentoring. I have workshop material for how to give technical presentations, but also all of the test strategy stuff as well has its own workshop material too. So if you want access to these slides, here is the reference. You can also go to bughuntersam.com/testingyourcrap, and you'll have references for all of that material.